NTV Television Network presents The Other Day, Current Era 1984. Translation and voiceover by BMI Russian. Good evening. Welcome to episode 24 of our series The Other Day 1961 to 1991 Current Era. Events, people and occurrences that defined a lifestyle. Things that you can't imagine us without, let alone comprehend. Another year, another episode. In today's video, 1984. The school system reform. Afghanistan casualties, Zhenya Kissin, diverting rivers, Platini, Indira Gandi's murder, the Lada Samara, British coal miners go on strike, Andropov's passing, love and dove. Commenting we have actress Tatiana Drubich, economic expert Yegor Gaidar, author Anatoly Strelyany, Central Committee member, Foreign Affairs Minister Raoul Leroy and other officials. A new word, Asisyai. This was the first famous sketch by a troupe from Leningrad led by Vyacheslav Polunin and called Litsidei, involving a clown wearing a dandelion-colored sweater and holding a huge toy telephone. The word Asisyai actually came about by accident, when Polunin unintentionally mumbled it during one of his mime performances. And now it became his second name. The Litsidei combined pantomime with clown antics. The somber Litsidei were unrivaled in the laughter through tears genre. Another word that they enriched colloquial Russian with was nizya. In 1984, mass production begins of the first Soviet VCR, which was called the Electronica VM-12. The new device was sold for 1,200 rubles in a select few Soviet cities to those who registered 6 months in advance. A good 40 firms were involved in the production of the Soviet Union's first video cassette recorder. However, the most important component, the tape drive, was sourced from a foreign company. Electronica's VCR was unreliable, noisy, and it chewed tapes. The only way to connect it to a TV was through the antenna cable socket, which seriously impaired image quality. Only 4,000 units were made that year. But more importantly, the first domestic VCR's debut effectively legalized video screenings. Up until then, such equipment raised suspicion when it was in private hands. But from then on, people would grow the forbidden fruit in their very own gardens. In England, the birthplace of professional unions, a massive coal miners' strike began. Out of the 180,000 union members, 150,000 were protesting. Nottinghamshire miners didn't support their colleagues, and the union arranged pickets at the remaining active coal mines. These meetings were suppressed by police squads brought over from all around the country. The strikes were caused by the government's decision to shut down 20 mines and fire 20,000 people. This was the lengthiest strike in all of English history. For an entire year, both Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher and mine worker union leader Arthur Scargill were standing their ground relentlessly. Soviet trade unions were expressing their solidarity, with our Central Council of Workers unions sending material aid, and families of English miners being invited to vacation in Crimea and Caucasian health resorts. The government unleashed an entire army of policemen on the protesters, hoping that repressions would break their will to carry on. What you see here is a struggle between classes, with dozens injured and hundreds arrested each day. In the 6 months of protests, the courts have issued over 6,000 verdicts. Their own country wasn't as sympathetic. The power and metallurgy unions refused to support the cause. And in March of 1985, the rebellious union, having gained absolutely nothing, was forced to cease and desist. On February 4th, 1984, Yuri Andropov passes away. after being leader of the Soviet Union for a mere 15 months. Few people know that Andropov had pretty much been living in a hospital since September of the previous year. However, it was impossible to conceal the General Secretary's absence at the ceremonial meeting commemorating the anniversary of the October Revolution at the USSR Supreme Soviet session in December. The medical report on the cause of his death published in the papers stated that as of recently the head of state was being kept alive thanks to an artificial kidney machine. Konstantin Chernenko was elected the new General Secretary. In his final years, Brezhnev was almost always accompanied by Chernenko. However, it was only at Andropov's funeral where the country heard Konstantin Chernenko's voice for the first time. My dear comrades, the hearts of the Soviet people are in deep grief after the passing of Yuri Andropov. The artificial kidney that used to be a power structure cornerstone was replaced with a breathing apparatus. Chernenko was terminally ill even before he got elected. You could especially see how frail he was when Western leaders visited the country, which happened pretty rarely in '84. That year, Spanish King Juan Carlos and his wife Sofia came to Moscow for the first time. This elegant monarch from the House of Bourbon was a stark contrast to the new General Secretary, who received the nickname Kucher, spelled by his initials and first letters of his last name. They removed the memorial plaque from the building on Bolshaya Brannaya Street where Chernenko used to live, though they left the one dedicated to Suslov. Chernenko was quite unlucky in terms of historical memory. He always seemed a bit redundant, an unwanted repeat of Brezhnev in his later years. When he first appeared on the radar, he was ripped to pieces in popular lore. There was an anecdote that went, without coming to his senses, he proceeded to fulfill his duties as General Secretary of the Communist Party Central Committee. His passing was met with an especially ruthless joke that went like, Igor Kirillov, the country's #1 news anchor, appears on screen dressed in black and says, "Dear comrades, I know you're gonna laugh, but Chernenko also died." An exotic style finds its way onto dance floors, with people dancing on their backs and moving like robots. This was the breakdancing craze making it to the Soviet Union. In the US, breakdancing appeared as early as the 1960s, and by the mid-70s, this style, born in black neighborhoods, grabbed the show industry's attention. And in 1984, the success of a movie called Breakdance sparked a worldwide trend. We knew, thanks to rare video screenings, that Michael Jackson was a breakdancer, and in a few years, Vladimir Presnyakov would learn the craft. Komsomolskaya Pravda reacted to the new trend to the effect of, breakdancing draws a person away from the need to contemplate. Breakdancing was apparently the be-all end-all. They took acrobatic rock and roll and disco, both taken to their respective extreme, and added some hop into the mix. Pretty much any dancing requires training, but breakdancing requires professional training. And there's a strict age limit. If you're over 20, the only way you're breakdancing is if that's your lifestyle. A new trend had appeared among teenagers, more radical than anything else conceived by the youth. This was their dance. They separated themselves from their ancestors with these escapades. Like all things extreme, breakdancing wasn't due to be popular, and like all things cutting edge, it promptly went away, lasting for only 2 seasons. A school system reform was kicked off. They decided that Soviet children should start going to school at 6, just like in many other countries. Also, instead of 10, there would be 11 grades. Sections of schools with rooms for sleep and games were allocated for 6-year-olds. One lesson would last for 30 to 35 minutes, and they'd stay at school until the evening, just like in kindergarten. 4-year elementary schooling was reinstated. Sending the older students to work at farms was now prohibited, and to keep labor training on point, they'd practice it for 8 hours a week, while, say, just 3 would go to literature. High school diplomas would no longer contain a grade point average, and all who finished school with 5s and 4s need pass just 2 exams while scoring no less than 4 to enroll into college. And since this was the second time in a short period when they amended the education system, the idea was that there would be no more reforming Soviet schools, all the way into the 21st century. In 1984, for the first time in Soviet history, they reburied an emigrant on his home soil. For a long time, it was thought that first-wave emigrants simply made a terrible mistake and suffered the most for it themselves. The great singer Fedor Shalyapin was never treated with any animosity, at worst with skepticism, with his famous portrait done by Kustodiev depicting him as a squire in a lush fur coat. Shalyapin's ashes were returned under the guise of a so-called public initiative. The literary newspaper published a letter by prominent music business figures about Shalyapin's contribution to the arts, stating that the emigrant Shalyapin never separated himself from the motherland and was never an opponent of the Soviet regime. That last caveat was crucial, and the fact that it simply wasn't true was even written out in official sources. Shalyapin's casket was removed from his tomb at the Batignolles cemetery in Paris and then transported to Moscow. Religious ceremonies were banned, and immediately after officially delivering Shalyapin's ashes to the Soviet side in the Bolshoi Theater's hallway, he was reburied at the Novodevichy cemetery. His complete exoneration would take a full 7 years. In 1988, they opened a museum in Shalyapin's old home, and in 1991, they restored his title of People's Artist. In September of 1984, a match for the title of World Chess Champion began in the Pillar Hall of the House of the Unions, where the reigning champion Anatoly Karpov squared off with the young and ambitious challenger Garry Kasparov. According to the rules, he who was first to win 6 games would become the new king of chess, with no limit to the total number of games. Thus, the 2K rivalry was born, the most dramatic saga in the 1980s-1990s era of chess. At the start, Karpov was quite energetic, quickly amassing win after win, until reaching a formidable score of 5-0. The reigning champion was one step away from victory. Realizing this, Kasparov just began playing the game without worrying about the result. Karpov wasn't getting any closer to confirming the kill, which was getting him pretty anxious. Game 31 was when the tables turned. Despite his superior position, Karpov made a few mistakes that almost cost him the game. And then at Game 32 came the sensation, when Kasparov racked up his first win. That was followed by a series of draws, everybody settled down, and Kasparov was labeled as an enduring loser. Then came a double sensation, with Kasparov winning games 47 and 48. This created quite a stir, with some claiming that Karpov was on the verge of being totally depleted. After that came the sensation that topped everything else, when World Chess Federation President Campomanes called for a press conference and announced that the match would be ceased, and that a new one would kick off on September 1st with the score reset to 0-0. Karpov, who wasn't looking too sharp, claimed that he was very much able to continue, and that was when Kasparov took the stand. You want me to speak right here? No, I'm just gonna stand right here. For the first time in 5 months, I was given a slim chance. A slim chance, like 25 to 30%, and now you're trying to take that away from me. With these constant delays, I want those who are dragging out this match to answer for it. The game was meant to go on, like I said 2 weeks ago. No timeouts, no breaks, but it is continuously being delayed, and each such delay increases the reigning champion's odds for winning, while reducing my own. There. The unity of Soviet sports was shattered. Karpov and Kasparov were forever destined to be nemesis. The official statement read, "The champion agreed with the decision. The challenger submitted to the decision." On June 9, 1984, a monstrous tornado sweeps over the Volga-Vyatka region. Ivanovo province suffered the most damage. The 1,500-foot wide dark spiral sucked up everything in its path. Villages and dacha settlements were totally ravaged. The tornado ripped houses from their foundations, tore trees out of the ground, snapped utility poles like matches, while getting cars and railroad carriages airborne. What took place is almost unimaginable. A tornado Some were jumping out of airborne cottages, while others were watching refrigerators fall onto their property. It all happened on a Saturday and in fair weather, with many spending their weekend in the countryside. That made the death toll even worse. More than 20 people died in the Yuzhny Dacha cooperative alone. How many people were affected in total was unknown. 417 families lost their homes. Construction materials, blankets, and tableware were sent to Ivanovo province from all around the nation. Weather forecasters instructed people what to do in case of a tornado. Dive into a hollow and hold on tight to something. For 5 years, the Soviet Union had been employing labor of folks from the socialist Vietnam. They would come over with zero qualification, receive an education and internship, and then work at an assembly line, which was something that the natives hesitated to do, and they would rarely visit their homeland. In Moscow, there were 10,000 Vietnamese workers at the ZIL factory alone. They found their way into metallurgy, mechanical engineering, home construction, and furniture assembly enterprises all around the country. At first, it appeared that inviting Vietnamese workers was actually us being helpful. Vietnam had an overabundant workforce and a lack of qualified specialists. But soon Soviet industry could no longer do without workers from Vietnam. They were like a labor army, agreeing to any kind of work and not eligible for a free apartment. In the country's industrial hubs, Vietnamese folk became part of the social fabric, not just the production process. It wasn't even about the workforce. Vietnamese workers brought with them to the USSR Asian-style markets, involving steely salesmen with trays. Trade with Vietnam was established earlier than with China and Turkey. The goods and cash basis would come later, with them providing the goods and us the cash. In the beginning, goods were going both ways. The Soviet Union supplied cameras, electrical appliances, sewing machines, and watches, while Vietnam supplied knockoff jeans, jean jackets, baseball caps, sneakers, and t-shirts. Initially, the Vietnamese traded within their own dorms in the USSR. Then they moved to flea markets. In those cities where they were allowed, they would promptly strike deals with local law enforcement, as well as trusted drivers and train conductors who would transport bales with things. If a conflict occurred, the instigator would be dealing with the entire Vietnamese commune. When clashing with Russian authorities or Caucasian merchants, the Vietnamese would win thanks to their sheer numbers and their ferocity. Salted fish was considered a national staple in the Soviet Union. The words herring and vodka, which rhyme in Russian, were used as often as love and blood in folklore. In 1984, the Communist Party and the government decided to lower the price for herring and Japanese pilchard. Barrel salted went for 1 ruble and 50 kopecks instead of 2.50, while canned spice salted was now 2 rubles per kilo instead of 3.20. On Thursdays, cafeterias all around the country served fish, to everybody's disgust. However, herring was the best snack out there. Prices were reduced for the delicacy varieties, which were harder to move. They went well with just black bread and onion, and if the lady of the house was generous, she'd cover everything with an egg beat mayonnaise coat. Herring was a good snack to enjoy with any type of alcohol. I never knew it could be like this. Thank you. It was still fresh in everyone's memory how 4 years prior, in 1980, Western countries led by the US boycotted the celebration of sports and peace held in Moscow. And now it was time to retaliate. The USSR's National Olympic Central Committee decided that Soviet athletes were not to take part in the 1984 Summer Olympic Games that were to be held in Los Angeles. The ruling was preceded by a propaganda campaign that had been going on since the start of the year. Hostile parties were allegedly planning provocative acts and terrorism. They also claimed that our athletes might be in danger and be subject to blackmail and violence. Following the USSR's example, several other socialist countries also decided to withdraw from those games, except for Ceausescu's Romania, that was always trying to show its independence in all matters that weren't related to the economy. The entire stadium in LA stood up to cheer for the renegade Romanians. As to keep the passion from fading in athletes from other brotherly nations, an alternative event called Friendship 84 was held partially in the Union and partially in other great sporting countries from the socialist bloc. Track and field was held in East Germany, weightlifting in Bulgaria, boxing in Cuba. Sporting style was all the rage in the 80s, with broad shoulders and everything beneath the belt being tight as possible. Male and female silhouettes both bore the same likeness to an upside-down triangle. Geometrical and straightforward were the main fashion trend. Snap buttons replaced the traditional variety. Normal earrings gave way to gigantic lightweight clip-ons. In the summer, those were complemented by rattling bracelets worn on both arms. The more modern an upper garment, the more it looked like a skiing outfit. Instead of the modest colors of the usual demi-season and winter coats, you were seeing quilted jackets colored bright yellow, pink, green, or violet. Puffy ones. As for footwear, trendy folks preferred gorgeous-looking puffy rubber-soled tractor boots. Women's wardrobes would always include a tubular hat. Apparently, at first, people were pulling oversized sweater collars onto their heads, but then realized that you could knit standalone items, which looked like a sort of mix between a hat and a scarf. Each new Soviet leader proposed his own recipe for saving the national farming sector. Under Chernenko, they ruled that everything was down to amelioration. The plenary meeting on amelioration attributed special importance to the redistribution of water resources. 150 research institutes were working on a project which involved diverting some of the northern rivers to flow southwards. Usually the project was simply called Diverting the Rivers. They were genuinely looking to command them about turn. Scientists and experts from the Water Resource Ministry explained Mother Nature's mishap, that too many rivers were flowing north instead of to the fertile southern lands. Their water was simply going to waste in the Arctic Ocean, all while the black soil steppes weren't getting enough water. Thanks to floodgates, canals, the lakes and small rivers of Volga and Arkhangelsk provinces, Karelia and Komi, the northern Dvina, Pechora and Onega's discharge were supposed to be partially reversed. Socialist economy makes not what's necessary, but what it's capable of making. The result is always less important than the volume, the scale of resources utilized. That's how operations were evaluated, by how much money was spent, and effectively wasted. If some big agency was actively throwing money at some project, it would be praised, and its management would receive awards and honor. The decision to divert northern rivers, in terms of how much sense it made, that was insanity at its peak. The country was in serious trouble. There was no economic growth, oil prices were low, amelioration was receiving dozens of times more funding than, say, the civil instrument industry. We initiated the diversion of northern rivers southward in order to raise the level of the Caspian Sea. But why even bother? Mother Nature can solve that problem for us. The level of the Caspian Sea has been going through cycles of changes for centuries. By the time the project was more or less finalized, the Caspian was already on the rise. Better contemplate some other cyclopean project, like how to save the Caspian shores from flooding, and how to divert water from the Caspian Sea. Then again, none of this mattered anyway. When you have the unique opportunity to squander tens of billions in government funding, how can you turn down such an amazing project? Those who conceived the project were determined and optimistic. They insisted, while invoking foreign experience, that the entire world was redistributing aquatic resources, and that for us there was no way to eliminate droughts in the Don, Kuban, and Caucasus regions without water from the north. Experts were actively discussing the matter. While not disowning the project entirely, they did call for accurately calculating the volume of water being relocated as well as the economic benefit of doing so. Though discussions didn't go anywhere beyond internal professional discourse. Uncompromising negative attitudes were openly expressed by authors Sergei Zaligin, Valentin Rasputin, Vasily Belov, and scholar Dmitry Likhachev. Their main concern wasn't even protecting the environment. They were worried that diverting those rivers would destroy the last remnants of national fundamentalism, and that it would wreak havoc in the Russian north, the final sanctuary of true Russian tradition left standing, effectively making this project anti-Russian. The project was ultimately shut down both because such arguments were now being heard, and because the whole thing just seemed too old-fashioned, in the spirit of raging Bolshevism. There were more monumental scams to work on, them being somewhat more modern to boot. Plans for radically remodeling the landscape became obsolete 40 years prior. Slogans such as "the waters of the Kuban River flow to where the Bolsheviks need them to go" were no longer accepted. The most famous musical prodigy. The big hall of the Moscow Conservatory hosts a performance by 12-year-old piano player Zhenya Kissin. The crowd was ecstatic, with people describing his playing as borderline genius. Zhenya Kissin was accepted to the Central Music School when he was only 6. He had only one teacher whose name was Anna Kantor. The boy from Moscow with curly black hair becomes the pride and hope of the Russian school of piano. Come next year, the 13-year-old child prodigy would begin touring abroad. His performances with Herbert von Karajan's orchestra lifted Kissin to the very top of the international music star hierarchy. Near the end of 1984, the Volga automotive plant begins production of Lada model number 8. All previous iterations were based on the 2101 platform, which itself was a Fiat 124 from the 60s. Meanwhile, the number 8 was designed entirely in Russia. This was the new base model, and the first in a family of wedge-shaped and chisel-like cars. The car boasted revolutionary styling. It was a revolution on the inside, too, being the first Soviet car with front-wheel drive and the first passenger car with a 5-speed gearbox. It's one thing to look at a car from a domestic buyer's perspective, but it's a completely different story to see it and wonder what foreigners might say. Never had a Russian car looked so much like an import. The 08 was even approaching foreign designs in terms of efficiency, with 15% better fuel economy than that of its predecessor. 1984's most high-profile terrorist act, Indira Gandhi's assassination. The people of India saw the Prime Minister's murder as a national tragedy. It was also quite a shock for the Soviet Union. In the years that she was the leader of our great southern neighbor, Indira Gandhi became a household name in the USSR. India seemed like a country of jungles and fragrances, where elephants carried piles of precious stones, and women wrapped in delicate fabrics presented garlands of flowers to guests, led by the noble Indira, daughter of the noble Jawaharlal Nehru. But as a matter of fact, India was permanently on the verge of civil war, though we weren't vocal about it prior to the assassination. Indira Gandhi was killed by 2 of her bodyguards, who were ethnical Sikhs. The Sikhs in the state of Punjab were long in conflict with the central government, demanding they establish an independent Khalistan. Gandhi's murderers turned out to be part of a separatist terrorist organization. The problem was that there were usually plenty of Sikhs working in security agencies and in the military. The head of India's counterintelligence did want to relieve those 2 from their duties, but Gandhi herself objected. That very same day, Indira's son Rajiv Gandhi became the country's prime minister. Soviet TV audiences were shocked by the funeral ceremony being shown in such detail, where the son was lighting the fire that burned his mother's corpse. Indira Gandi's ashes would be scattered over the Hindu Kush mountains, next to the source of the Ganges. The Riga Cathedral reopens after restoration work. This 13th century architectural monument was used as a concert hall. The cathedral's organ was one of the best in Europe, and the most famous in the USSR. This monumental structure that is the Riga Cathedral is an architectural ensemble of national importance. Construction began in the year 1211. The organ pipes were transported to Holland for repairs. In a rare turn of events, central media followed the restoration of the former church and its main musical instrument from start to finish. They restored the lower stage, the second player's keyboard. They also built a platform for chamber choirs. Each year, 300,000 people came to see the cathedral. That's basically every tourist who came to Riga. In 1984, the European Football Championship was held in France. The receiving side's national team, led by Michel Platini, put on a brilliant performance, winning all 5 of their games, scoring an overall 14-2, and securing the championship. Out of those 14, 9 were scored by Platini. In the mid-1980s, the French national team was in its prime. Its backbone was the midfield, consisting of Giresse, Platini, Tigana, and Fernandez. They were considered the best in the world. The incredibly smart and capable Platini was declared Europe's best player 3 times in a row. Playing for Italy's Juventus, he won everything there was to win, and was universally recognized as one of the top 5 players in history. Shortages, waits for apartments, elder leadership, and alcoholism all seemed somewhat moot, as none of those were matters of life and death. From the mid-1980s until the end of the decade, Afghanistan was the main issue of our country's foreign affairs and internal policy. Most of the articles written about Afghanistan weren't painting a coherent picture. A rare exception was a piece published in Izvestia in the summer of 1984, with a detailed account on the military operation in the Panjshir Gorge. Usually, our soldiers would be delivering flour to remote kishlaks, and even taking part in landscaping work in Kabul. Messages on life in Afghanistan read like they were about a socialist country, with PDPA Central Committee plenary meetings, and Comrade Babrak Karmal visiting the USSR. Twice a year after demobilization, waves of stories from Afghanistan would roll around the nation, where they'd use such words as Dushman, Shuravi, Kandahar, BTR, BMP, Spetsnaz. The limited military contingent had already been inflated to 100,000, while the amount of demobilization albums made every year was on par with the capacity of state propaganda. Those depicted tan guys wearing sunglasses and military-issue hats, wrapped in ammo belts and armed to the teeth, wearing God knows what kind of footwear, since Kirza boots were no good in the mountains. The thing is that in a guerrilla combat situation, it sometimes happens that soldiers inadvertently make themselves out to look like who they're fighting. At the time, we less often referred to Afghanistan natives as Afghans than we did our own guys who served in this country. 1984 was the year of our biggest losses in Afghanistan. Flights carrying Cargo 200, which is code for zinc coffins, were being made more and more often. Military commissariats were paying for funerals, and public tombstones would read 1964 to 1984, and even 1965 to 1984. They are transporting heroes back home again, digging out graves for 20-year-olds. The war had been going on for over 4 years at that point, longer than the Great Patriotic War. Mild disapproval among the population gave way to starkly negative attitudes. (2,343 Soviet warriors were killed in Afghanistan in 1984. Details were purposely withheld from families, anything more than phrases such as "when fulfilling international duty." Other Afghanistan stories included horrible circumstances of state-sponsored funerals, closed caskets, people asking, "Is that my son you brought?" as well as commissioners demanding that relatives keep quiet and not be overly dramatic. Our people were used to the fact that soldiers killed at war would tend to be buried on the spot, committed to the earth, so to speak. Then war broke out in Afghanistan, which was either in the east or the south. Nobody really knew. Information was covered up or distorted, and those who were killed in that war for whatever reason were delivered back home, on board special aircraft in zinc coffins, so-called Cargo 200. We knew that this wasn't a sign of being on top of things, sending planes to retrieve corpses. We even knew that this practice was introduced by the Americans. They had corrupted Russia. If they decided that they shouldn't send the fallen back home, as the Americans do, we would have conquered Afghanistan. If they were to count the dead with no regret, they would have been counting the living likewise with no regret. However, the leaders of two superpowers agreed on the need for more active dialogue. In 1984, a message was issued on reinstating V.M. Molotov as a member of the Communist Party. The message indicated that, first of all, Mr. Molotov was still alive at 96 years of age, and second, that Chernenko was willing to demonstrate his own political convictions without a second thought. The entire 18 years he was in office, Brezhnev never found the courage to exonerate the head of Stalin's cabinet. Molotov first became a party member in 1906. He was the last living member with a party pseudonym. His real last name was actually Skryabin. Khrushchev ousted Molotov back in 1962, and since then the old Bolshevik was constantly sending applications to be restored in the Communist Party ranks. After the 25th Congress, a special panel was even put together that presented proof of Molotov having a hand in arranging mass repressions. In May of 1984, Molotov sends yet another application. And on June 7th, the forgotten Sovnarkom chairman was picked up from his country house and delivered to the Central Committee to meet with Chernenko. And on June 12th, a brand new membership card was delivered to Molotov's home. Those who were paying attention sarcastically remarked that Chernenko was preparing his successor, which sort of turned out to be true, as Mr. Molotov did actually outlive Chernenko. Vladimir Menshov, who made the movie Moscow Does Not Believe in Tears, once again proves to be a profitable filmmaker. His comedy film Love and Dove was the most popular picture in 1984. It was about a country mechanic's holiday fling and the never-ending conflict between village and city. What's the matter with you? Leave the guy alone. That's basic combat training right there. Go about your own business. Let's just say you passed. Menshov decided to go slapstick and get movie and theater stars to break out of their usual molds. The old drunkard and his stern granny were played by such royalty as Sergei Yursky and Natalia Tinyakova. Lyudmila Gurchenko's heroine, a city dweller to the core, was well versed in the main fads of the decade: hypnosis, psychic powers, UFOs. Otherwise, the characters communicated using popular terms. Oh, so it was moving organs they were treating. Moving organs. Now I would happily chop off those moving organs of yours. What is wrong with you people? Some criticized the film's director for pandering to vulgar tastes, while the fans were delighted by what they called a true folk comedy. Calm your mother down. Easy. Easy. You hag. You hillbillies. And that was 1984 in our show the other day, 1961 to 1991, current era. Events, people, and occurrences that defined a lifestyle. Next time, we're going to be featuring 1985, the Ruslan airplane, Chernenko's passing and Gorbachev's rise to power, Star Wars, the attack on Danai, Yelena Safanova and Winter Cherry, aerobics, the old Arbat becomes a pedestrian street, the fight against drinking, the Moscow Youth and Student Festival. See you for a new episode and a new year. Farewell.